Você está no canal Brasil, uma realização da FEComércio São Paulo, que hoje conversa com o consultor britânico Richard Lapper. Esta é mais uma entrevista da nova série do canal, produzida em parceria com a revista Problemas Brasileiros. É a série Brasil Visto de Fora, em que vamos conversar com especialistas estrangeiros e brasileiros de vários cantos do mundo para entender sobre a ótica deles um pouco mais sobre o nosso país. Já conversamos com o professor Marshall Wiking, com a pesquisadora Irene Vidagala e com a pesquisadora Alison Federka. Todas as entrevistas já estão disponíveis no nosso canal no YouTube e no site da revista PB. Antes de iniciar a entrevista, eu te lembro também de se inscrever aqui no canal e de nos seguir nas redes sociais. Richard Lapper é escritor e consultor especializado em América Latina, afiliado ao think tank britânico Chatham House. Ele trabalhou no jornal de economia Financial Times por 25 anos e ocupou o cargo de editor para a América Latina. E Lapper também é autor do livro Beef, Bible and Bullets, Brazil in the Age of Bolsonaro, que acabou de ser lançado e que pode ser traduzido por algo como Boi, Bíblia e Balas, o Brasil na era Bolsonaro. Nesta conversa nós vamos falar sobre a obra, a situação política e econômica do Brasil e como o país pode ser comparado com outros países que também estão vivendo polarização e movimentos populistas pelo mundo. Hello, Richard. Welcome to the Brasil channel.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Daniel. It's very nice to be here.
Great to talk to you. So I'd like to begin asking you about your recent book. The title of the book talks about the age of Bolsonaro. And I'd like to ask you, how different is Brazil in the age of Bolsonaro, as the title say, in comparison to what the country was before the president was elected?
That's a very good question, Daniel. I lived in Brazil between 2002 and 2008. So I was covering Brazil when Lula started his mandate, and when he took over, a situation of extreme financial crisis in 2002, and gradually things got better and better and safer from an economic point of view during the 2000s. So that by 2008, when I left Brazil to move to Africa, Brazil was really living what Lula himself described as a magic moment. They were doing so well at that stage that Brazil was exporting huge amounts to China. It had got a current account surplus. The real was getting stronger every month, it seemed. A lot of that surplus was being recycled towards ordinary Brazilians. So, the PT governments introduced Bolsa Familia. They introduced Crédito Consignado, so they were, that people could borrow for the first time. A lot of poorer people who I remember interviewing, and I described some of these examples in the book, were able to obtain credit to buy, consumer goods. They'd be buying flat screen TVs. They'd be buying cars on 7-year loans and so on. But it was a time of abundance for people. And a time of, prosperity. In Brazil then discovered oil in 2006, the pre-salt, and then they started beginning to exploit that. And, Brazil became a brick. It was one of the countries that was transforming the world. And I think, when Lula handed over to Dilma in 2010, everything seemed to be set fair. We remember that cover of The Economist magazine in, I think it was 2010, when the Christ statue in Rio de Janeiro is taking off like an aeroplane. So it was a very interesting, a very positive period. And then I think, looking now, 11 years on, Dilma, 10 years on, I suppose, Dilma took over in January 2011, and looking on now to July 2021, it's very different. Things have fallen apart. The economy entered into a very severe recession, one of the biggest recessions in Brazilian history in 2014-15. A lot of that, I think, was due to a very, very poor management by Dilma Rousseff and by her ministers. And then so a lot of the things that people have been used to, which was, things are getting better, things are getting more stable, we're getting better off. Suddenly it was getting worse. Unemployment started to rise. credit was less available. People started to experience problems. And then in 2014, the Lava Jato investigation started. And that seemed to sum up a popular mood of frustration about politics and politicians. And I think people began to things were getting bad, and they started to blame politicians for that. And there was a huge rise in disbelief of politicians. People began to see politicians as distant, as essentially benefiting at their expense. And, the mood became very, very bleak. And we had this, this year of 2016 when Dilma was impeached, and Temer was hugely unpopular, though he survived. And it created a political vacuum in a way, I think, that huge reaction to react to the recession and the political crisis around corruption. And I think something else then began to happen, which is that I think some of the seeds of right-wing populism, we started to see them operating in Brazil. And I think there are, this is a complex process. It's, Brazil's not the only country that has, a right-wing populist president. We've seen President Trump in the United States. We've seen Orban in Hungary. We've seen various experiences in Europe, ranging from the Law and Justice Party in Poland to Brexit in my own country, in Britain. We've seen Duterte in the Philippines, who goes around, sort of threatening to shoot, to just basically kill drug traffickers, no matter how much he's criticized by the international human rights community. So we've seen many examples of right-wing populism. And I think in Brazil, this vacuum that was created by the reaction to the recession and to politics allowed Brazil's own version of this right-wing populism to come in. And we can talk about what are the ingredients of radical right-wing populism in Brazil.
What I wanted to know is when you talk about all those different countries, and you talk about Hungary and about Philippines and very different countries in very different areas of the world, and they all have the similarity with Brazil. What I wonder is the Brazilian right-wing populism any different from these others? Are there any ingredients in the Brazilian right-wing populism that makes it stand apart from the other ones?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are similarities and differences. I think in Europe, clearly the main trigger for populism in Europe has been mass migration from outside Europe, actually, from within Europe in some cases, but mainly I think it's been about there's a popular reaction in Germany and Hungary to Islamic migration in France, and there's a cultural clash, I think, there, and right-wing politicians have argued against unlimited Islamic migration. In the United States, there's been a more constant migration, really, from Latin America. So Hispanic migration, particularly from Central America and the Caribbean, has been a big trigger, I think, particularly actually from the countries of the Northern Triangle, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. There's been a lot of migration, and that's been a trigger of concern there, and something that Trump really built his appeal on, really, people's discomfort with that migration. In the Philippines, there's been right-wing populism has grown. I think has been fed by a concern about organized crime and the drugs traffic. And Duterte, who took over as president in the Philippines, I think in 2016, off the top of my head, he has advocated a hard-line reaction to organized crime, very similar to the kind of policies that the right in Brazil are seeking to impose on, and they want to basically, look, we've got these organized crime gangs, we've got to go in hard. If we kill people, that's fine. If you need to defend yourself against them and kill these guys, that's fine. We've got to do that because we have to protect ourselves. I think that's very much Bolsonaro's discourse, and that is what is an important thing. That's one of the important ingredients in Brazilian right-wing populism. So it's a reaction against the rise of organized crime. Now, I think one of the ironies of violence and crime in Brazil is that between 2004, roughly, and 2012, we saw an improvement in the level of, the rate. It was getting safer, actually, in many cities. When I first went to Sao Paulo in 2003, it was extremely commonplace to talk to people at dinner parties or having a drink with people, and everyone would be talking about being carjacked. When I left Brazil in 2008, those discussions were much less common. Sao Paulo's crime rate improved, and its violent crime rate and its death rate from violent crime improved enormously in the 2000s for various reasons. And I think that also happened in Rio. It got to a lesser extent, but it did get safer in Rio. The death rates per 100,000, as these things are measured, fatalities per 100,000, fell off very sharply during the 2000s. The problem was that between 2013 and 2018, there was a pickup in violence. And one of the principal causes for that rise in violence, and I explain this in the book, was the gang war between the two largest Brazilian crime gangs, the First Command of the capital, based in Sao Paulo, and Red Command, based in Rio, and their local affiliates. And basically what was going on between 2015, from 2015 to 2016, was a battle for control of drugs routes in the north of Brazil. And that meant that in poor areas, in cities like Fortaleza or Salvador, Recife, all these places saw big increases in fatality rates, big increase in gang killings. There were big increases in prison killings. I mean, enormously, highly publicized scenes of violence in Brazilian prisons, where basically PCC prisoners were massacring or Comando Vermelho prisoners, or vice versa. Comando Vermelho would be decapitating members of the PCC. And these images were constant in the Brazilian media in those years. And I think, it fed a kind of sense of great anxiety about organized crime. And I think there's always, a fear in Brazil of, the outsider, the dangers of the favela, because frankly, these places are quite dangerous. If you go in there and no one knows who you are, you don't do that. It can be dangerous. There's always a great fear, and I think that fear became much greater because of these because the death rate was increasing, and B, because it was becoming it was attracting a lot of attention, a lot of media attention. So I think what happened then was that when I was in Fortaleza in 2018. So this was before Bolsonaro's election. I remember I was sitting in a restaurant in Fortaleza by the seaside on the Saturday before I was due to fly out. And I saw on my phone a video of Cabo Catia. Cabo Cacha, the policewoman, off-duty policewoman in Sao Paulo, in a suburb of Sao Paulo. I can't remember the name offhand. And there's a guy with a gun who comes up, and she's at school with her daughter. It's a Saturday morning, and she shoots him. And this image became viral in the next 24 hours. The next day, I was in Salvador having lunch with my mother-in-law and various cuñados, and everyone was talking about this video. Everyone was talking about this video. And then 6 months later, guess what? Cabo Cacha is elected as a member of a diputada for Bolsonaro's party, for the Social Liberal Party. And that happened a lot in Brazil in the election in 2018. We had how many military policemen or ex-military police officers were elected? I think over 30 in 2018, a lot of them for the PSL. And, I think that was a bit of a phenomenon that drove populism in Brazil. I think another thing that drove it, which I think is extremely important, and I talked in the book to a lot of evangelical Christians. So Protestants in Brazil, it's grown a lot, yeah? So the broad context for your viewers is that in 1980, 6.6% of Brazilians were Protestants. By 2010, I think it was, the last census, there wasn't one in 2020, there were 22% of Brazilians were Protestants. During that 30-year period, the population of Brazil had grown enormously. It had grown, so we, from something like 10 million, we then had 40 million Protestants. And that number has continued to grow. I mean, the latest polls suggest 30% of evangelicals are Brazilians are evangelicals. Now, I think what's interesting about this is that evangelicals voted very heavily in favor of Bolsonaro. I think more than 60% of evangelicals voted for Bolsonaro in 2018. Why did they do that? Well, I think the answer to that is quite interesting, because they're not necessarily, evangelicals don't necessarily support the political right. A lot of evangelicals favor progressive social welfare reforms and social welfare measures. During 2002, the evangelical churches backed Lula. They were allies with the PT government. But what they're very uncomfortable about, gender policies. So they're uncomfortable about, in a broad sense, along with Brazilian Catholics, they're uncomfortable at abortion. I mean, that's a commonality amongst, and so any move to liberalize abortion is always complicated in Latin America because of the strength of Catholicism. And I think that many evangelicals, not all of them, but most of them, are also against that. But I think what particularly alarms radical evangelicals, and I say radical, I mean the neo-Pentecostals, churches like the Igreja Universal or the Renascer, these kind of churches, what alarms them and what leads them into political activity supporting right-wing causes is the sort of moves to criminalize homophobia. It's a very controversial. I talk to a lot of evangelicals in the city of Uberlândia in the Midwest of Brazil, in Minas Gerais, and the thing that I thought was quite notable was how none of them like gender politics. It's something that really that goes against the grain, and for evangelicals. And so I think that when Bolsonaro got into his his anti-gender politics, anti-liberal vibe, during really he kind of he said these outrageous things, that he'd rather his son died than became gay and all the rest of it. I heard a lot of that. I think there's a lot of grassroots amongst evangelicals. There is an awful lot of sexual conservatism about sexuality. They're very uncomfortable with this move, which is an international move. You know, there's a lot of, it's about gender politics, about breaking down traditional definitions of sexuality, of sex roles, and so on and so forth. This is stuff that is deeply disturbing to evangelicals. And I think that was a feeder. You see this in Eastern Europe as well. I mean, it's a big issue in Poland right now. The discomfort that people, that a lot of right-wing voters feel about sexual liberalism. And, you know, and the other thing, of course, I think that drives it, and this goes again to the Beef, Bible and Bullets title of the book. The other thing that drives it is discomfort with, you know, the environmental politics. You know, for many people in agribusiness, I mean, I think agribusiness is quite divided. I think a lot of big agribusiness companies, although they were supportive of Bolsonaro during 2018, I don't think I think they know that they need to take measures in relation to the environment. They know they can't, you know, they know they'll lose markets. It's in their self-interest to be green. But I think for many smaller farmers, garimpeiros, loggers, people, you know, that sort of floating population of the Amazon, that, you know, they don't have, they're sometimes in the informal economy, they're not secure, many of these people. They see environmentalism as a direct threat to their chances of making money, and you know, whether it's survival or whether it's making, you know, an okay living. Then many of them are not wealthy, but they see environmentalism and IBAMA as kind of imposed from the outside and not being about their interests. So I think that's another feeder of this kind of virus of right-wing populism in Brazil. I think, you know, the sort of environmentalism, this reaction to these liberal preoccupations, environmentalism, gender politics, liberal approaches towards criminality and the human rights of criminals. So all those things, you know, tend to trigger the right, I think.
And these three Bs that you use in the title, they also go beyond Bolsonaro, don't they? And I mean, my question is, right now, Bolsonaro is weakened. His popularity is lower than it's ever been. And there is a lot of talk about impeachment or not impeachment, or what's going to happen. But these caucuses are going to continue influencing Brazilian politics, aren't they? So my question is, where are they leading in the future, in the post-Bolsonaro age?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. And I think one of the things that's quite difficult to answer is that I think we can now add a fourth ingredient. When I started the book, I started writing the book in 2019. But of course, the big change in Brazil since then has been the pandemic. And Bolsonaro's approach to the pandemic, you could almost say that's also an ingredient of a right-wing approach, right? Because he's been a denialist, and it's clear that other denialists, I mean, Trump was a bit of a denialist. I don't know about Orban in Hungary, but it's notable that Hungary has a very high death rate from COVID. And I think many of Bolsonaro's grassroots supporters do not like, I mean, quarantines are not popular in Brazil because many people just, you know, it's either we starve to death or we die of COVID. We'll take our risk. And I think, you know, chloroquine has been a kind of mobilizing tool for Bolsonaro. He's used chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine as a kind of, you know, his supporters love it. You know, they love this idea that this is, and even though it's, you know, it's unproven, the side effects from these drugs are potentially very damaging. No epidemiologist would recommend you take chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine. They're not they're not drugs that are going to do any good, according to, but many of Bolsonaro's supporters, including many doctors, are supporting the use of these drugs, and Bolsonaro still continues to advocate in favor of their use. Here we are, July 2021, and what's very clear is that broad alliance between the anti-PT, the Lava-Jato, the sort of, the liberal conservative or the traditional conservative and the radical right, the sort of hardcore raiz Bolsonarismo, has begun to fragment, and it's left Bolsonaro with a support base of 20-25%, according to the most recent polls. What's unclear to me is how that will be affected if Brazil, as it's beginning to do now, starts to get control of the pandemic and the death rate begins to fall further. We've seen now, I think 40% of Brazilians have had one dose of the vaccine. I think we're up to about 14% with 2 doses. So it is getting, by the end of the year, Brazil will be reducing its death rate from the pandemic. The economy is beginning to grow quite strongly in Brazil. We're looking at 5% growth this year. Admittedly, that's after a terrible year in 2020. Unemployment's still very high. 14.5 million people unemployed. Inflation's very high because one of the things that's making the economy grow is high commodity prices. So the question then is, will, by the time the election campaign starts next year, will the economy have begun to have a feel-good factor? Will it begun to have improved people's mood in Brazil? And if it does, then that could benefit Bolsonaro. And you might find that, Bolsonaro will be back up towards a level where he could win an election. I mean, it wasn't until March that March this year, when opinion polls started to show Bolsonaro losing in the second round. I mean, we've seen now, I think, something like 10, 11 opinion polls since March, which has shown Bolsonaro losing, and they've been quite big votes against Bolsonaro in some of these polls. So, Lula could win in the first round, but things may change if and I think that's, I think a lot of these more socially conservative features of Brazil are quite deeply rooted. The big interiorzão, it's a more conservative place, Brazil, than many people think. And I think it could become, I'm not sure it's going to go away. And then we've got, an additional factor, which we've not talked about, which is, the risks to democracy and the military and what their interests are in this.
I was going to ask you about that. Do you include the military in the bullet caucus? Or do you think that's a different category, a different influence in the government?
Yeah, I mean, traditionally, the bullet caucus doesn't really include the military, does it? But I think, in a loose sense, I think they clearly are. I mean, in the sense that, the military are very heavily invested in this government. I mean, Bolsonaro, from 1990 until, I suppose, about 2005, his main goal in politics was representing the military lobby at a time when the military were not a fashionable cause in political circles. Bolsonaro is a very complex figure. He was kicked out of the army, obviously. But there are more military officers in this government than at any time since the dictatorship. So there is a certain amount of investment from the military in this government's survival, in a way. At the same time, as Bolsonaro and his ministers become more and more unpopular, there'll be a tendency for many military officers to say, we don't want much to do with this because this is damaging our institution. And certainly when Bolsonaro intervened to stop, Pazuello, his former Minister of Health, was allowed without any punishment to take part in a political demonstration, which under military rules he shouldn't have done, and that's a very bad. It's a very bad example. It's a very bad precedent for Brazil, the extension of the military. I mean, if military officers can take part in demonstrations for a particular party, that means they can become influential in a direct way. I think that we think Brazil's is more and more polarized, perhaps, than ever at the moment.
The other thing you were talking about before, it's about what you call the interiorzão, and the rural areas of Brazil. And I was wondering if you could tell me, what is your perception about how ideologically different, politically different they are from urban areas, and how much does that influence in the political situation of Brazil as a whole?
I think, I think it's to repeat, really, I think it's quite, I remember seeing Alberto Acosta, who's a sociologist in Sao Paulo, did a book in 2007 called A Cabeça do Brasileiro. And I'm struck by reading that book. I was struck by how conservative social attitudes were in Brazil. And I think that's particularly true amongst less educated and poorer Brazilians. And it's also particularly poor in remote areas. I think it's also true, in Europe or in the States, people who live further away from, the sorts of centers of economic centers, people who live in the Midwest or people who live in smaller towns in England tend to be more conservative. And I think they, a lot of people in Brazil aren't very interested in politics. They just want to get on with their lives. I'm very struck when I go to somewhere like Uberlândia, where my cunhado lives, his wife and family. It's people just, they don't talk a lot about politics. They're getting on. I mean, in the Midwest, what are people talking about in the farming belt of Brazil at the moment? They're talking about the rise in land prices. The land price, land prices are going through the roof in Brazil. The big farmers are making a lot of money. They're not talking about the issues that concern the metropolis. They're talking about land prices. They're talking about, land deals. People in small towns in the States are talking about property prices. There's a lot. I think, it's a mistake to think that everyone is as interested in politics as we are. And I think that's particularly true in Brazil. Latin America, perhaps, some countries in Latin America, there's a lot of, people are perhaps more interested in politics because it's more volatile. Brazil is slow moving. It's quite volatile, but it's slower moving than some of its Latin American, neighbors. And that, I think there is that big interior phenomenon in Brazil,
When you put together this lack of interest for politics or the disbelief in politicians that you mentioned before, that was one of the problems of Brazil, as well as the popularity of fake news and how people don't really know about reality. How can we think about a future Brazil where politics are stable if we have these different factors that are putting in place a situation in which populism rises?
Yes, I think the issue is an important one. I think one of the things that's particularly difficult in Brazil is that, the written media, the sort of newspapers were never that widely read. So in Britain or in Europe, perhaps the States, we do have a fairly long tradition of written media, writtens of local papers, of most people, perhaps not so much now because newspapers have died a death, especially local newspapers. But there's there are a fairly important ingredient. Local media, local radio is a fairly important ingredient of democracy. And I think that's less true in Brazil in general terms. Obviously in the 70s, TV became, Globo became very important. But I think, and I think that newspapers, I remember, my wife's from Bahia, from Salvador, Bahia. And I remember when I first went there in '98, there was A Tarde was the local newspaper, which, and it doesn't really exist anymore. It's online. It's not got the same. And I think in this environment where newspapers are finding it very difficult, there's not a strong consciousness about news. I think, social media does tend to fill that gap. And so there is a lot of fake news in Brazil. People making use of WhatsApp, people being on. Brazil also, I think, was quite an early adapter of things like Facebook, Orkut, the big social media site that was Brazilian developed. So I think that was these were. There are various reasons why social media is important in Brazil. And, clearly Bolsonaro has used social media, particularly Carlos Bolsonaro is organizing a lot of the output and has done since 2010, we understand. They are making a lot of use of social media. There may well, I think that there's an awful lot, when you have that, there is an awful lot of space for people to make all sorts of mad assertions. There's no, you read things on Twitter, you read an awful lot of rubbish when you read Twitter. I mean, it's easier for you or I, who are journalists and kind of know about it, to sort of read between the lines and know what to trust. But, most people get a deluge of stuff on social media. And, for people, as I say, who are less educated, and Brazil does have relatively low levels of education, particularly in poorer rural areas, they tend to believe what they read. And it's a danger. I don't think. I think it's a problem. No question about it. Fake news, and social media is a problem. And the lack of an accountable media is a problem. We need a media that's not over politicized to explain what's going on.
I'd like to get to the end of the interview, going back to the beginning. When you started explaining the situation that led to the age of Bolsonaro, you mentioned that Lula used to talk about the magic moment of Brazil.
Yeah.
But you also talk about how prevalent populism is in Brazil and in Latin America as a whole. So should we look at this period of the magic moment as the exception, as something that was a different Brazil, and now with the rise of right-wing populism, we are back to what Brazil really is? Is that the narrative, or how should we think about that? Can we believe that a magic moment will happen again in Brazil?
Oh, well, I suppose the question is, to what extent was Lula a populist?
That as well, yeah.
But I think that I think that I think Brazil in a way does have a tradition also, the kind of more greater political pragmatism and slow change. So it's perhaps, it has had, Getulio was a populist without any question in the 30s. But I think there's also, a tradition of pragmatic political management, especially at a local level. So it doesn't seem to, I don't think, it's not, Brazil doesn't have Argentine-style populism where, the dominant political culture in Argentina, Peronism, as a constant really for the last, what is it, 70 years, or like Mexico, where you have the PRI, and you know, I guess AMLO at the moment is a sort of variant to the PRI in a way. You know, I don't think Brazil is like that. I think it has it does have populist elements to the political culture, but I think it also has this pragmatism, and it, you know, it's and I think in a way Lula was a pragmatist. I mean, as a trade unionist, he wasn't known as a trade unionist who was always making impossible demands. He was a guy who was looking to get the best for his members. He was a negotiator. As a president, Lula, you know, was incredibly cautious about how he managed the economy. I mean, someone once told me that anytime he made a big economic decision, he always consulted his central bank chief, Enrique Meirelles. You know, economic management was loosened in the run-up to the 2010 election, but it was relatively cautious before that. Lula, Lula obviously became associated with Lava Jato and so on, and, you know, sent to jail for that involvement, but he wasn't, I mean, I think one of the problems about that is that he was, to the extent that the PT were involved in corruption, I don't think it was that much greater than had been typical in previous Brazilian governments. I think that, you know, it may be on a bigger scale, but, you know, a lot of people in Brazil, that kind of political corruption had happened before. As the Lava Jato, you know, when Lava Jato first was investigating, I mean, they were finding lots of people from all sorts of parties, including parties that now support Bolsonaro. So I think, you know, I don't think Bolsonaro is I don't think Lula's a classic left-wing populist, really. So I think Brazil, there is a chance that Brazil could embrace a more cautious, pragmatic kind of politics. I think what's essential for Brazil is to engage some kind of political reform to make politics and parties more meaningful to people. I mean, I think it's one of the very unfortunate effects of relocating the capital to Brasilia, that it means that politicians are seen as a bit of a kind of group apart by many ordinary Brazilians. That it's so far away, and you know, it doesn't connect with people's lives. And unfortunately, some of the reforms that are now under consideration, the Distrital and so on, would probably make that worse, actually. So, you know, I think that's an override. You know, some kind of political reform is a necessity for Brazil, but it may not happen for a while, at least.
Yeah, we have to hope for this pragmatism that you talk about in the long term. We'll see.
Yeah, I mean, I think pragmatism is the only, you know, some form of cautious reformist pragmatist reformism is the only way to do things, really. You know, it may have to be quite cautious because, you know, I think you can't do things, you can't go too fast for people. You've got to take people with you.
Well, Richard, thank you so much for your time. It was really good talking to you. The book is really interesting. I enjoy reading it, and I really like the way that you are describing the country that sometimes even ourselves in Brazil don't know that much because we are stuck in our own urban bubbles and we don't travel around that much. And it's important to know more about that. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Daniel.